Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Amber and I am the student rep for the final year anthropology class here at the University of Manchester. Today I'm really pleased to be speaking with Anthony Simpson, who is the head of the Anthropology Department here. We're going to be speaking about his own background and how he came to pursue anthropology himself. To give you just a little overview on Tony, he is a medical anthropologist who has spent over 25 years conducting fieldwork in Zambia, where he explores issues of education, identity, masculinity, and sexuality, among other things. And he situates these within the context of the AIDS epidemic there. I'm really excited to be speaking with Tony. He is actually a large part of the reason that I myself came to study at Manchester.
Oh dear.
I think he's a wonderful representative for how fascinating and also how cool of a subject anthropology can be. So without further ado, welcome Tony.
Thank you very much, Amber.
No problem. So I'm going to start by going straight to a photo of your family.
Yes.
Is your mother's family in Trinidad.
Yes.
So can you tell me a bit about your mother's background?
Sure. Okay. So this is a photograph of my grandparents. It's either the 50th wedding anniversary or the 60th wedding anniversary. I suspect it might be their 60th, although my mother looks a bit younger. So my mother is one of the three women at the bottom. She's the one on the left. So there's my mother, then there's my Aunt Pearl, and then there's my Aunt Imogen on the right. So there's the three women. And they didn't make it to this celebration in Trinidad. That's in the garden of my grandparents' house in Diego Martin. And then you'll see my various uncles. There's one aunt there in the background. There's one uncle missing. He was called George, and he was killed in the war, in the Second World War. He joined the Air Force and trained as a pilot, and was killed over Germany. And my grandmother also had several children who didn't survive to adulthood. And like many women at that time and that period and that place, many miscarriages as well.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, these are the children who survived. It's amazing to look at them now and think they're all dead. I find this quite extraordinary. Maybe we get to that stage in our lives where we go, gosh, I knew all these people and they're all gone.
Mm.
I think thinking about, how do you come to anthropology? I'm just wondering whether I was an anthropologist before I knew the word anthropology. And that's why I thought I'd start with my background in a way, or say something about it. And because I think if you grow up, as it were, the term is mixed race in some way, then you immediately have a sense of difference. You know that there's another world somewhere. So I was born in 1949 and I grew up in Lancashire, in Blackburn. And I'll say something a little bit about my my father's side of the family later. But there you've got my grandfather and my grandmother. And again, this notion of mixture and race and difference, but also ideas about class and gender, I think, are also important. Mm-hmm. My grandfather there, Albert Antonio, I'm named after him, Antonio. His father was Antonio. So my grandfather's grandfather was a freed African slave called Henry Dormer. Mm-hmm. So in the 1830s, slavery was abolished in the Caribbean. Well, it took a long time actually to go away, but officially. And so my grandfather's grandfather was a freed African slave. He was actually a house slave, not a field slave. But I'm not quite sure. I don't think we know enough about, at least I don't know enough about the difference, but I imagine a house slave is somehow closer to the owners than if you worked in the field.
Yeah.
So there he is. So his grandfather, as I say, was a freed slave. Now the grandfather had one daughter, and that's then the mother of my grandfather. And the interesting thing about Henry Dormer was he took his daughter to school, and there was only one school in Trinidad where you could carry black people to school, a school called Tranquility. So he must have had some, I don't know, some ambition perhaps. He took his daughter to school. So she went to school in Tranquility. Then my grandfather's mother then married a man from Portugal. Actually, we discovered he was a Jew, or he was from a Jewish family from Funchal, from Madeira. Mm-hmm. So here you've got a Portuguese man marrying this African woman. So that's why my grandfather has a Portuguese name, although the family actually changed the spelling of the name to the Spanish spelling. There's some kind of, lots of discussion about why was that change made.
Mm-hmm.
So there you've got my grandfather. So his father died when he was young, and he then was brought up by his mother, and they didn't have any money for him to go to school. So she used to grow vegetables, and he used to carry them to the nearby shops for sale. Quite a number of the shops were owned by Chinese people. This is another interesting thing about the Caribbean. You have such a mixture of people. So he, as a little boy, carried these vegetables for sale. And one of the Chinese owners of the shops thought this boy is quite bright. So he is the one who sent my grandfather to school. Otherwise, I'm not sure that my grandfather would have gone to school. He went to school because this Chinese man saw something in him and thought he would benefit from an education. So what I'm trying to say is that you already have a sense of difference.
Yeah.
That I've got my grandfather, this mixture, this Portuguese Jew from Funchal.
Yeah.
There's the slave ancestry. And then if I look at my grandmother is also was a very interesting character, very forceful person. They were both forceful in their different ways. Mm-hmm. And her mother was a mixture of Carib, the Carib. There were Caribs who lived in the Orinoco Delta and also lived in Trinidad. They were called island Caribs in Trinidad. So her mother was a mixture of island Carib, so the indigenous people of that area, mm-hmm. and African.
Okay, so there's a lot going on there.
So her mother then also had children with two men, one an African man, a man of African descent, and one an Irishman. So my grandmother then was descended from this Irishman, I think Northern Ireland, mm-hmm. And then this mixture of the mother. And I think what's interesting about thinking about it is how if you're thinking about anthropology, how you grow up with a sense of difference. You grow up with a sense of, for me, a sense that there could be another world. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Lancashire.
Yeah.
My father, come to my father's side for a moment. My father was one of the three children of my grandparents. My grandmother was a weaver. Lancashire is famous, of course, for cotton. So she was a weaver. She had four looms that she weaved. She was a weaver. My English grandfather had been injured in the First World War, and he was something of an invalid, but he had been a baker. Mm-hmm. So then you get this situation where, I think class also comes into it. I mean, what the things that we're interested in as anthropologists, race is a very topical issue, class is another one. And there you have a mixture of class because and religion as well. So you've got my father, who came from a very working class background. He left school when he was 14. He went to, first of all, got a job sweeping among the looms, and he got a job selling bicycles. He always used to say delivering bicycles, I should say. He always used to talk about how he wasn't allowed to ride them to the people who bought them. He had to push them. And he had stories of Saturday nights, they wanted to eat something nice for Sunday, so they'd wait until the last minute to rush down to the market in town to see if they could buy a rabbit for sixpence, mm-hmm. because they knew that at the end of the day, then the end of the weekend, things would be going cheaper. And I always remember he used to talk about how the area that he lived in, when people got electricity in their homes, they used to go and look. They used to go and say, oh, so-and-so's got electric lighting. And they actually used to go around just to experience.
Yeah, that's exciting.
It's quite amazing to think that this is we're not talking about a long time. Okay, I was born in 49, so I'm now 71. But, we're not talking about forever and ever long ago.
Yeah.
The only reason why my parents met was because my father was in the Navy because of the war. Yeah. And at the end of the war, there was a naval base in Trinidad, an American naval base, a place called Chagaramas. And my mother's aunt, I knew her, she was also quite a character, and Vivi organized tea dances for the sailors. Mm-hmm. So his ship ended up, so this is 1945, he ends up in Trinidad. Aunt Vivi is organizing these tea dances, and my mother played the piano. So my mother would go to play the piano. So she'd be playing Begin the Begin. You probably don't know that song, but you can check it out. And that's how they met. And they married well, maybe at the end of the war, people felt that there wasn't too much time, that you had to kind of seize the day.
Yeah.
So they married in 45, the end of 45, and they came to England in 1946.
How was that experience of coming to England as an interracial couple at the time?
It was very difficult, especially I think in the north of England. Mm-hmm. The other two women I pointed to, the aunts who didn't get to the anniversary celebration, they lived in London, and I think perhaps because they lived in London, they had more contact with people also from the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. My Aunt Pearl was very involved in music and art and theatre. She had married actually a well-known singer and actor, and from Trinidad, but of African descent. Whereas my mother was in the grim north.
Yeah.
On her own. She experienced a lot of racism, mm-hmm. And it hurt her. And I think it was particularly shocking for her because she grew up in a British colony. You have to know that Trinidad was Spanish and French, all kinds of people, those Caribbean islands. Trinidad and Tobago's part of the same country. Tobago changed hands more than 30 times.
Wow, that's
in the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and the British, people fighting and having, there were wars and then there were treaties and you can have that peace. So she grew up in Trinidad, but because of my grandparents, especially because of my grandmother was a very forceful character. And my grandparents generally, but my grandmother in particular, was determined that all her children should have the best education. So they were sent to the best schools. So although my grandfather had been a headmaster and later became a civil servant, it was my grandmother who kind of was the driving force. She got cows and the culture and milk the cows and sell the milk, and then she bought taxis, and she had men to have a taxi business, and that's how she managed to finance the education of these children. But they had to go to the best schools, so they went to the best schools. They went to Catholic schools, although they were not Catholics. My grandparents were Presbyterians.
Okay.
But they went to the best school at the time was thought to be the Catholic school. So all my aunts and uncles, including my mother, but it was a rather kind of posh school. It was like it was French nuns who'd come to Trinidad originally, more than 100 years ago, and how they and so it was more like I would say it was more like a finishing school. There was a class element in it, and connected to that. And this is the point I wanted to come back to in relation to my mother. Is that in Trinidad, she in the family, she was one of the lightest skinned ones. And tone and color and all these things, people notice them. And the lighter skinned you are, the better you are. And I had that experience later when I went to Africa. But anyway, so she grew up actually, not only we might describe her as middle class, but also she was rather at the top of that class. Mm-hmm. Then she comes to England. Yeah. Miserable. She arrived in November from Trinidad, having had a colonial education. You're going to the motherland. It's going to be wonderful. Anyway, your brother died in the war. Your brother went to England to fight for this country. And then racism, hostility. Yeah. In many ways, I think she didn't recover from it. And also my twin sister, I have a twin sister 5 minutes older than she is. She appeared, you could see Africa in her features, in a way that apparently you can't see in mine. I don't know. We don't know how other people see us. So at school, she was always treated as an outsider. She also experienced a lot of rejection. We were living in an industrial town in the north of England, growing up there in the 40s and the 50s. And that was a very painful experience. Yeah. What amazed me was how people, I remember it was a fellow pupil who told me that my mother, who actually pointed to my mother and pointed out to me her color. These are very striking things, aren't they? I hadn't noticed somehow.
Yeah.
And when he said it, I saw it. And we have to be careful with memory, don't we? We have to be, Bourdieu talks about the biographical illusion. We have to be careful that we produce a narrative about ourselves. But this is I think this is a fairly sure memory that I had. So my twin sister and I had very different experiences. So I grew up rather liking this stuff. I rather liked the idea that I was a little bit different from the people in my class at school and stuff. The people who were, although of course they were Polish, or but they were white anyway at that period. I liked it, where she suffered always because of it. And so you know, as I say, if we're looking for the seeds of how do you come to anthropology. So I lived in the north of England. I didn't go to Trinidad until I was a young adult.
Yeah.
But every now and again, these people would arrive from Trinidad, and they look different, and their body language, their embodiment in the world, the food that they cooked.
Yeah.
And so you have this, and then when I eventually went to Trinidad myself, it was like the ceiling had been taken off the world for me.
Yeah.
It was an extraordinary experience.
But so
you had sorry?
You definitely grew up with a feeling of difference throughout your entire life.
I did, but I liked it, you see. I rather liked it. I thought it's not bad to be a little bit, you know, we wouldn't use this word anymore perhaps, or it's a dangerous word, exotic. But I liked the idea that I was somehow, you know, a little bit different. But that's because I never suffered from it, whereas my twin sister always suffered from it.
Yeah.
It had all kinds of consequences for the rest of her life. I mean, she's still here, and we still spend a lot of time together, but we had very different experiences growing up.
Do you think that might have also been connected to the fact she was a woman who was mixed race?
Yes, it could be. It could be. I think also things like, you know, in those days we had the dreaded 11 plus exam. I passed, she didn't. And so you're immediately sent in different, you immediately have a different trajectory. Okay, oh, you passed the 11 plus. I remember the day I passed the 11 plus. There was a man who lived next door to us, and he had only had one eye, and he came and he brought me half a crown, because this was such an event, an achievement. And of course, for my father, who didn't, you know, who had to leave school when he was 14, except said she was sent to what they called in those days secondary modern school, but that was also a very negative thing to happen to somebody, to choose to put people on completely different paths, and to decide at the age of 11, you know, you're going to have this path. Although I never planned to go to university or anything, but you know, all those possibilities were open to me in a way that they were never open to her.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So in terms of university, you left school, you went into an English degree for a few years, and then
slightly complicated in the sense that I never wanted to go to university. So ever, it was not in my plan. So I wanted to be a monk in a contemplative monastery. And so first of all, I ran away from Blackburn, and I went to live in London with the same aunt in the middle, who was involved in theatre and stuff. So I spent a year or two working with her in London. It was an exciting time. The 60s, the late 60s. It was an exciting time to be in London. Lots of stuff was happening.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to join this monastery, a French order, silent order. My friends were surprised because they think I'm rather talkative. But the abbot of the monastery said, this is a life of silence, and it's enclosed order. You don't go out. This is it. Come here. This is it. He wanted me to have a degree. I didn't want to go to university, but because he wanted me to have a degree, I thought, what could I do? So my A-levels were English, Latin, and French. And I thought I was quite good at English. So I applied to London University, to King's College, but I actually hoped they wouldn't let me in. I was hoping that I would apply. They would say no, because I only wanted to live in London, because I was used to living in London then. And then I could go back to the monastery and say, I tried, but sadly for me, they let me in. So then I did an English degree. And then I went to the Caribbean for a little while, because my grandparents were very worried about me. They thought I must be a very, very sad person to want to be a monk. They saw it so much as a denial of life.
Right. So
they called me there for 6 months, and that was a wonderful time to spend just time with your grandparents, you know. Just a wonderful moment. And then I came back to England, and I was in the monastery for a couple of years. That didn't work out, but that's a very long story. And then I applied to an organization that sent people to volunteer anywhere in the world. And they said, what can you do? And I said, I'm not sure I can do anything. And they said, well, do you have any qualifications? So I said, well, I have an English degree. She said, oh, you're an English teacher. So I said, huh? Yes, you're an English teacher. So that's how. So then I said I'll go anywhere. So I just, and it was by chance that they sent me to Zambia.
Okay, and that's how you ended up in Zambia. And
I promised to go for 1 year, but the deal was if you didn't stay for 2 years, you had to pay your own fare back. So there was a kind of an inducement to stay the second year.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of the second year, I suppose your heart is taken. You're taken. You have these wonderful students.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I would be eaten alive in England if I tried to teach, for example, in the second school. They would have just they'd chew me up and spit me out.
Mm-hmm.
But there you have these young people. It was boys' boarding school, a little bit in the bush.
Mm-hmm.
And they just, of course, you have to remember, no TV, no internet. We had a phone, but it hadn't worked for the last 5 or 10 years. You know, so we were in a fairly remote, quiet place. And they were the first people in their families to go to school. This education theme, you know, I think about my grandparents, think about my dad, I think about me. And they were the first people in there. So they were from subsistence farming backgrounds.
Yeah.
And they came to school. And so this thing called education and the dream of education was that, you know, your life will be transformed.
Yeah, so they really wanted.
It's so important. So people will watch you. People will watch you. They're very good at. I used to have a competition every year for the student who could do the best imitation of me when I was teaching, and there's very good imitations because they watched you very carefully. I often had to give prizes to students who. So you have this very attentive, you know. So it was then. But what really brought me to anthropology, although again I still didn't know the word. I suppose the word was in the world, but it wasn't in my world. Because we were a little bit in the bush, the road was very bad. It was often impassable at certain times of the year. And because by the 70s, the economic situation in that part of Africa had deteriorated very seriously, mid-70s, late 70s, because of the so-called oil crisis in the Western world. It just had all kinds of ripples to, you know,
Yeah.
to form a colonial world. By this time, Zambia was independent. So there was a clinic, and the man who ran the clinic was a French missionary, and he was recalled to Haiti. So they needed somebody to help run this clinic. So I volunteered. Now, whether I should or not is another matter, because we had a lot of medicine. We had a lot of medicine from Spain and from Germany and stuff.
Yeah.
But did I have any knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
The answer is no. I had a book. There were two books. One was one book called Where There Is No Doctor, and the other book was called Where There Is No Midwife. So I left the midwife story alone, and I just had the Where There Is No Doctor. But it was mostly malaria. Everybody got malaria. Bilharzia, anemia.
In the deep end there.
Yeah, I saw a lot of venereal disease actually, which I had never seen before.
Okay.
So I was quite ignorant in many ways. But
Link-
that's where my education started, I would say, in Zambia, in many ways. Although there was this other experience of the Caribbean and stuff. Sorry, I interrupted you.
And that's okay. At what point when you were there did you decide, okay, I'm going to go do an anthropology degree now?
Okay, so while I was doing my English degree at London, I became interested in quite a few of my friends had what is often colloquially described as a nervous breakdown. So I became interested in what happens to people, you know, the fragility of people, and what there's that poem, isn't there? We easily do break in spite of the best overseeing. Who's poem? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So that was one aspect, the psychology side. And then working in the clinic, people came and I realized, of course I was naive, I should have realized, I mean, it's kind of obvious now, but their understandings of their body, of what happened inside their body, the extent to which their bodies could be invaded or not invaded, how people who were jealous of you could make you ill, could even kill you, how, you know, the world of spirits, you might become possessed. There were so many aspects about being human. I mean, the embodied self, and also suffering, you know. So I suppose in some ways I'd gone from this idea of being this contemplative person to kind of moving into this active person.
Yeah.
And so you taught all day, and then I was involved in digging wells and growing maize and looking at, like 500 or 600 students in this school, and a lot of them would be sick, and you'd be in bed at night, and then you get a knock on the door. You've got to come quick. Somebody's really sick, and you go to the dormitory, and all the students are watching you. You have to make a decision. You have to do something. You have to solve the problem. And people knock. I remember one knocking on my door, and this young man said, "You've got to come. This boy, he can't breathe. He stopped breathing." And you rush there, and you try and see what you can do to help. But I mean, whether anybody should be at the mercy of people like me is another matter, But you have to understand that this period in Zambia, there were very, very few Zambian teachers, local people, and so people were eager to get people from outside. The situation's changed now, but even when we started getting people in the 70s, Zambians who were qualified, who had a degree or teacher training, they could get better jobs out of education. So that's how people like me ended up there. But the other thing also that struck me was, I was really lucky that in the holidays, I had a friend and he had a car. And he sold his record collection, I remember he almost cried when he had to hand over his Carole King LPs. And I got a bit of money from somewhere, so I paid for a couple of wheels and some tires, and between us anyway. So every holiday, we traveled. So I went to all the parts of Zambia, and we went to look for students, because at that time the students could come from all over the country.
Okay.
As part of President Kawanda's, because there are so many different ethnic groups in Zambia, the idea was that education would somehow bring it all together, would create this sense of nation. But when you find yourself like 1,000 miles away in a very remote area, you arrive in a village and everybody in some way, or you must get.
Oh,
hello.
One sec.
Yes.
Okay, I think you're back.
Oh, good.
Sorry.
Yeah, so you have these. So all I was going to say was that I had the privilege of being able to go to many parts of Zambia.
Yeah.
And then you sit in a village at night. I always remember you go to a village and they wanted to look after you. And one of the things they would do was, you're in these places with no running water. When people have gone to a stream, and they would heat this water, and then you'd be given this bucket. You'd be taken to the place where people washed and stuff, and you'd be given this bucket of absolutely steaming hot water. I mean, untouchable, You had to bathe in it. So people looked after you. But then, of course, you thought, people have to walk a long way through this water. People have to boil it. People, you know what I mean? All these things. And then you realize, and then many of the students, they were the children of polygamous families, So you say to a student, how many brothers and sisters do you have? And they'd say, well, depends how you want to calculate it. My father has 3 wives or 4 wives. So really I have about 30 or 40 brothers and sisters. But if you just think about my, the womb that I came out of, then we were 9 or 10 or whatever. So what struck me was, because of course they all had to use English. But then these words like mother, father, home, all these words, you had to kind of think about, well, how do they resonate to somebody who comes out of a very different background to yourself? Yeah. So it was that. So it was my experience of teaching, and actually, I suppose, falling in love with them as people. It was my education of realizing how privileged I was, and it was working in the clinic and having this sense of illness and suffering. So I came back to England and I did a second undergraduate degree. So this is why I'm confused. So I did a second undergraduate degree in psychology and anthropology at Durham University. And then I went back to Zambia to continue. And I later came back and did a master's and a PhD. But I always intended to be back in Zambia. It wasn't part of my plan to be here. But when I wrote my PhD about the school where I was teaching. It's about the civilizing mission. It's about education. It's about, in some ways, the tragedy of how people take education as they still buy into, at that time anyway, they still bought into this idea that this is the white, not only do you have the white man's religion, Christianity, but you have the white man's education, and that somehow makes you better. So the degree of self-denigration that was still there is what troubled me very much. But it was also about Christianity. It was about this is a Catholic school, but it had groups of Seventh-day Adventists, people who were born again, Jehovah's Witnesses, and yet there was a lot of arguments about who's the real Christian, who's the right Christian. And the brothers who were Spanish and drank beer and drank wine and smoked cigarettes were considered to be definitely not Christians, really, even though they started the school. They were the kind of running the school. So that's why I kept, yes. Sorry, I mean,
you mentioned earlier your experience of being lighter skinned in Zambia. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. So one of the things that I realized when I was teaching there, because I was also a housemaster and that kind of thing, so you got quite, I mean, apart from the clinic side of the story, so you realize that a lot of students were using skin lightening cream, for example. So, and if you walked into a classroom and you said, you know, who's the best looking person in this room, they would always go to the lightest skinned person. So this idea, I mean, this shocked some of my, for example, cousins in the States and stuff, this idea that you're black and proud. People didn't feel that, but you have to realize, you know, it's like I don't even know whether we should call it the shadow of colonialism. But you realize the impact of colonialism. I mean, their parents, the students' parents would sometimes come to me and say, when are you white people going to come back and rule us? And then we will be happy.
Oh, wow.
So this great sadness that they had, this was an independent country, but I felt that the education they were receiving was still undermining the sense of themselves. And also, of course, I explained to them my own background, and some of them were extremely disappointed. They said, oh, this one, oh, we thought you were a white man. Oh. You know, but others would come to me afterwards and say, that's why you understand us. It's in the blood. Yeah. Why we connect.
Yeah.
You know? And then I would tease them and I'd say, yeah, but some of you guys who took some of my guys and carried them across, and sold them, and that's why they ended up on the other side of that.
Yeah.
Of that big sea called the Atlantic.
Okay. That's been really interesting. I think we've run out of time.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Tony.
That's fine. That's fine. It's nice to talk with you. Sorry if I've spoken too much.
No, not at all. I mean, I think I had a few questions, but I think you've covered them all in your stories, which has been great.
Okay. It's just, as I say, I think you know, for me, it was going to Zambia was very important part of my education. But as I said, then things got complicated with my PhD. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah, sure.
Is that okay?
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay, Amber. Thank you so much.
Right. Bye.